welcome back to Let's Read. Today we'll be reading The National Liberation Movement in Colonial and Semi-Colonial Countries by Trường Chinh. Another feature of the period following the Second World War is the broad and active national liberation movement in colonial and semi-colonial countries, which is shaking the imperialist system to its foundations. Colonial and semi-colonial countries, from having been a source of reserve forces for imperialism, are now becoming reserve forces for socialism. Following the First World War, the peoples of colonial and semi-colonial countries began to struggle for independence, but only sporadically. At that time, although the Russian October Revolution had succeeded and the capitalist system had begun to decline, the forces of capitalism were still strong, and the workers' movement in imperialist countries and the national liberation movement of oppressed peoples were not yet broadly organized, not yet closely linked together, and not yet led by powerful communist parties. Following the Second World War, the situation of colonial and semi-colonial countries changed markedly. The Second World War stimulated oppressed peoples to struggle against the fascist aggressors. At the end of the war, three fascist imperialist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, collapsed, providing the opportunity for oppressed nations to rise up and regain their independence and freedom. The victory of the Soviet army further weakened world imperialism and liberated many countries, opening up to them the roads to people's democracy. Former colonial or semi-colonial countries such as China, Vietnam, and Korea have become independent republics or are winning full independence. The national liberation movement is spreading widely in African countries. It has a universal, powerful, and resilient character, and there is no way it can be suppressed by imperialism. Put down in one place, it flares up in another. Sometimes it sustains temporary setbacks, but then quickly recovers. Generally speaking, the level of awareness, organisation and struggle among colonial and semi-colonial peoples is much higher than ever before. The peoples of Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. have taken up arms to fight the foreign imperialists as well as the international feudalists and comprador capitalists. Armed struggle has become the main form of struggle for peoples thirsting for independence and freedom. The working class and the communists and workers' parties in most colonial and semi-colonial countries have matured and are firmly in the leadership of the revolution. The British, French, Dutch and other imperialists, weakened by the war, have lost all authority over the people of their former colonies. The US imperialists have exposed their cynical nature. The divide and rule policy of imperialism has failed utterly. The colonial peoples can no longer bear to live as they did before. Neither can the ruling class in the metropolitan countries govern and exploit their colonies as they did before. The hour of liberation of the colonial peoples has sounded. The colonial system of imperialism is being vigorously attacked. The power and prosperity of the Soviet Union and other people's democratic countries is a great source of encouragement and support to oppressed nations now fighting for liberation. And now, by defeating the US imperialists and their puppets and liberating a vast area, a quarter of mankind, from the bondage, the Chinese people have just dealt world imperialism a very heavy blow. The historic victory of the Chinese people is of a decisive character. It sounds a call to the oppressed nations and the world's people to rise up and oppose imperialism. Following the example of the Chinese people, hundreds of millions of people in colonial and other dependent countries are struggling ever more vigorously. The struggle of these countries has become an essential part of the world movement for peace and democracy against aggressive imperialism. To cope with the liberation movement of their colonies, the British imperialists are trying to carry out a double-dealing policy. On the one hand, they declare recognition of the right to independence of colonial peoples within the British Commonwealth, a half-baked independence aimed at camouflaging machinations of the colonial power and continuing their policy of oppression and exploitation. On the other hand, they supply arms and money to the feudalists and comprador capitalists in these countries, employing them as hired assassins to suppress the people's revolutionary movement. In contrast, French imperialism persists in its traditional policy, clinging to its colonies and carrying out downright overt suppression, as in Madagascar. In Indochina, faced with the fierce wars of resistance of the Vietnamese, Khmer and Lao peoples, they also want to apply the double-dealing policy of British imperialism by granting fake independence to Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, meanwhile striving to organize puppet administrations, recruit puppet troops, carry out the vicious policy of feeding war by war, and using Indo-Chinese to fight Indo-Chinese. But the resistance of the Indo-Chinese peoples has become too powerful. The French imperialists are still obliged to send their own troops to suppress these peoples. They dare not give up military occupation and direct armed repression. So their policy of granting sham independence has become completely transparent. Now what about US imperialists? They intervene in the colonies of other imperialist powers, carrying out point 4 of the Truman Doctrine, seeking desperately to invest in the markets of other countries, buying over the puppets in the colonies, supplying money and weapons to the British, French and Dutch imperialists and their stooges, and employing the latter in the repression of the national liberation movements. As a result, US imperialism gradually encroaches upon the colonial interests of Britain, France and Holland and turns the colonies of these powers into its own markets and military bases, with an eye to grabbing their wealth to enrich itself and prepare another war. At present, US imperialism is the most dangerous enemy of oppressed nations. No matter what means and methods they may resort to, however, the imperialists cannot destroy the national liberation movement. The heyday of imperialism is past. The more they struggle, the more clearly the colonial and semi-colonial peoples realize that there is only one way to save themselves, and that is: number 1, to create national unity, to set up a broad national united front, including all forces opposed to imperialism and the ingenious traitors, without distinction of race, social class, religious belief, or political tendency. That front must be based on the worker-peasant alliance. Number 2, to be prepared to wage a protracted fight against the imperialist aggressors, to coordinate political and armed struggle, with armed struggle as the main form of struggle for national liberation. Number 3, the revolutionary movement in general and the National United Front in particular, the People's Liberation Army and the People's Administration, must all be gathered together under the leadership of the working class as the most loyal to the cause of national liberation, and the Communist Party the vanguard of that class. The leadership of the revolution cannot be entrusted to the national bourgeoisie and its political party, because they could easily compromise with imperialism and bring the nation back into subjection. Number 4, to keep in close touch with the international workers' movement, particularly with the workers' movement in the metropolitan country, to coordinate activities with the proletariat and the working people in the metropolitan country, led by the Communist Party there, against the common enemy, imperialism. To keep close ties with the world movement for peace, national independence and democracy, and to stand firmly in the anti-imperialist and democratic camp led by the Soviet Union. This is the only road to liberation of oppressed nations by which they can gain real independence. If the Chinese and Vietnamese peoples have won success, it is because they have followed and are following that road. The present war of resistance of the Vietnamese people against the French imperialists and the US interventionists and their puppets is an uncompromising form of struggle to regain national independence, realise people's democracy, and defend world peace. While waging a war of self-defence, the Vietnamese people are helping the French people and the peoples of the French colonies in a practical way in their struggles against French imperialism. At the same time, the French people's movement to defend peace and oppose the war together with the anti-imperialist movement in the French colonies are a valuable support to the patriotic war of the Vietnamese people. In conclusion, what do we see then examining the world situation after the Second World War? Number 1. The world is being violently shaken by the contradictions between the working people and monopoly capitalism, between the colonial and semi-colonial peoples and oppressive imperialism, between the socialists and people's democratic countries on one side, and imperialist countries on the other side, and also among rival imperialisms themselves. The contradictions are getting sharper, indicating a violent crisis of capitalism in its death throes. Number 2. World peace is being jeopardized by war-seeking imperialism. However, the forces of peace and democracy have become stronger than those of war-seeking imperialism. A world peace front has been formed, rallying all forces for peace against US imperialism and its lackeys. Should they unleash a Third World War, the US-led imperialists would simply be committing suicide. Number 3. The People's Democratic Movement is being consolidated and developed. The People's Democratic countries in Eastern Europe have begun to build socialism. The work of national construction in the People's Republic of China is showing visible progress. These facts are stimulating the peoples of many countries to boldly take the road of people's democracy. Number 4. The national liberation movement in colonial and semi-colonial countries is becoming daily more active and vigorous. Many oppressed nations are rising up to wage armed struggle, attacking the various bastions of the enemy, shaking the whole imperialist system and further strengthening the democratic and socialist camp. Number 5. The world has split into two camps, the camp of peace and democracy and the camp of war-seeking imperialism. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam sides with the camp of peace and democracy and against war-seeking imperialism. The Vietnamese Revolution is part of the world movement for peace, democracy and socialism. Vietnam's war of resistance is enjoying the sympathy and wholehearted support of the world's people, and the Vietnamese people have a very great obligation towards them. While defending their own freedom and independence, the Vietnamese people are also safeguarding world peace and the development of a people's democracy in Southeast Asia. Conforming to the world revolutionary trend and developing in favourable historical conditions, the patriotic war of the Vietnamese people, though still meeting with numerous difficulties and hardship, will certainly be crowned with glorious success. Thank you for listening. If you liked the speech, be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for more. Thank you.